Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dumbrill podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Kishore Mahbubani. He is the author of Has China Won, along with many other books, and he's also a Singaporean academic and a previous diplomat. He was also the president of the UN Security Council, and today we're going to talk about his book, of course, and also China-America relations. So without further ado, let's get to the interview. Okay, hello, Kishore Mahbubani. Thank you so much for joining me on today's show.
My pleasure to join you.
So we're going to talk a little bit about your book, Has China Won, which I just recently finished. But I have to say, it seems like a lot of the topics you've covered in your book are becoming even more relevant, especially recently with the recent escalations from the consulate issues and to Pompeo's recent, which some people are calling a pretty bizarre speech on China. It seems we're in a little bit of a downward spiral in terms of relations that have been kind of increasing in speed, don't you feel?
Yes. I was very saddened to hear the speech because you would give the impression, you get the impression from the speech that he is overestimating China. Actually, he's underestimating China by getting China all wrong in many critical respects, sadly.
Yeah, it does seem like that, doesn't it? I mean, and it's not only, I suppose this ties in, it's not only the government relationships that are becoming polarized, but the public opinion also is becoming more and more divided. And there's very few balanced voices out there. In that regard, I have to say there's actually a lot of people here in China that really appreciate what you do. Not because you're so-called, pro-China, like everybody likes to label somebody where they are, because you also talk about what the negatives are and what China needs to do better in your book, but because you're fair. But I'm curious, saying even the slightest positive thing about China tends to really irritate a lot of people. And I've experienced this firsthand. And I've read some of the colorful comments under the videos that you appear in as well.
Yeah.
But you've got a good track record on your predictions about the directions the world will take. And you rely on facts and data to talk about what you think will happen next and what's happening now. So have you, what I'm personally curious about, if you've ever analyzed or thought about this kind of reaction, and if you have a personal opinion on whether you think this is a problem with people truly not believing what you say or that they don't want to believe what you say, even though what you talk about is actually happening in front of our very eyes here.
Well, I think you put your finger on a great mystery. Why can't people be objective on China? So, for example, when Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says that President Nixon wanted to induce change, and he said change didn't happen. Actually, in many ways, America can take a lot of credit for the tremendous transformation that China has undergone since President Nixon visited China 48 years ago. So, in fact, the American dream of creating a China that joined the 1945 rules-based order has come to. And indeed, that's a lot that Americans can celebrate because they have done a lot of good in the world by integrating China into the world. They have actually helped to lift up 800 million people out of poverty. And that's the single biggest advancement in the human condition that has happened in the last 30 to 40 years. And America can take a lot of credit for it. So it's bizarre to see this very anti-China, pattern dominating American discourse, because there are lots of positive things that have happened in China that Americans should be happy about. But of course, the reason why you have this anti-China discourse is that there are structural reasons why a major geopolitical contest has broken out between the US and China. And I can talk about the structural reasons if you want. because that's what explains to some extent the negative sentiment on China. But the negative sentiment on China, if you can inject reason into it, can actually address the concerns that Americans have.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing for people to keep in mind, because there is this feeling of people saying that, you know, we've tried playing Mr. Nice Guy, you know, we've tried waiting for China to change, and now we're going to get tough. But like you said, China has been changing and China has been evolving all of this time. And the way that they're trying to engage China to change China more just seems really like bizarre, as you're saying. You know, in your book, you reference Lee Kuan Yew a few times, and he's you know, a man recognized as the founding father of Singapore. And I became a fan of his work after seeing his 92 panel with Chris Patton at Hong Kong University, where he had Chris turning red in the face after so eloquently calling out what the British were doing. But I learned so much more about him from your book. So I knew that Singapore had a great influence on China and people like Deng Xiaoping, but I didn't know how much Lee had as an individual. And I'm specifically talking about the example where he had a hand in convincing China not to spread their political ideologies abroad. And his ability to influence China was, of course, helped by his patient, calm, and respectful approach to understanding China. But it's interesting that the United States isn't trying to take that approach also, because it's proven to work. But before we get to that, I'm actually kind of curious if Lee Kuan Yew's philosophy on dealing with China has rubbed off on the people of Singapore, where they're willing to think about China more rationally than the rest of the West? Or are you a bit of a special case where you seem to embody a lot of his patience and measured approach when it comes to China?
Well, I would say that, you know, one of the great blessings in my life, as I look back on it now, is that I had the opportunity to work with not just one, but with three geopolitical masters of Singapore. They were Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, the Deputy Prime Minister, and Mr. Rajaratnam, the Foreign Minister. And all three had phenomenal minds. And as you may know, in some of my writings, I said that one reason why Singapore has been exceptionally successful is because the founding fathers of Singapore were as brilliant as, if not more brilliant than, America's founding fathers. So, you know, I learned a lot from them. And one of the clearest lessons I learned from them is that when you're from a small state, you have to be very, very realistic, because you cannot change the world. You have to understand the world as it is. You've got to deal with the world as it is, not the world that you wish that you had. And so that's the realism that I hopefully bring to my writings. And that's a realism which I hope can also be helpful to the United States to understand China, because one of my key points is that China is not a threat to the American way of life.
Right at a great spot, we lost each other. So I'm sorry. I'm going to get you to repeat that. My internet connection should be okay now. So I got to the point where you were talking about the other great leaders you got to work with. My internet connection should be okay now.
The one big lesson I learned from them is to be very realistic about the international environment, because a small state like Singapore cannot afford to engage in wishful thinking. We have to learn to deal with the world as it really is, not the world that we wish that we had. So in the same way, I believe that if the United States practices realism of the kind that George Kennan advocated in the beginning of the Cold War, realism of the kind that Henry Kissinger advocates, then America will discover that China is not a threat to the American way of life in any real way. In fact, in many ways, given all the problems that America faces today, domestic problems, America will be better off working with China rather than against China. And that's the rational course that I'm recommending in my book, Has China Won?
Right. And now it's interesting you mentioned the Cold War piece, because what I'm wondering is, in your opinion, so China has been changed by America in many ways, but has America really ever taken, was there any period of time where they really did take an honest, respectful approach to China? Or was, you know, back when they were dealing with them during the Cold War era, it was more because they had an interest in having a kind of a counterweight to the Soviet Union? Have you ever seen anybody, any administration or anybody who's really trying to engage China in the way, in the respectful ways that some of the Singapore founding fathers have?
Well, I would say on balance, if you look at the relations between United States and China from World War II, they went through three phases. From 1949 to 1971, in phase one, there was just hostility. And then, amazingly enough, after Henry Kissinger went to Beijing in 1971, and after Richard Nixon went to China in 1972, there was essentially a honeymoon, I would say, for 2 decades until 1989, when the Cold War ended and when Tiananmen happened. And those two events, of course, created a whole new phase of US-China relations, which I call the ambivalent phase, which I'm trying to put across also in my multiple open online course that I'm doing on US-China relations. And so there are three phases, but right now we are into phase 4, which is outright hostility. And that's something completely new. That goes back to phase 1.
Right.
From 1949 to 1970. But at the same time, I must emphasize that many of these trends could have been predicted by simple geopolitical analysis. So I've been predicting this US-China geopolitical contest for quite a while at the same time warning that it is not necessary.
Right. Yeah. Well, it seems in regards to the question about the strategic interest in China, it's interesting that you mentioned up until the end of the Cold War. And so some might try to make the argument that that's when China lost some of its usefulness in terms of strategic kind of positioning here. But I mean, you're right. Seeing what's going on now, before this consulate issue, tit for tat kind of a thing, for me, I feel like Marco Rubio's Interparliamentary Alliance on China, the IPAC, is kind of the epitome of the, disrespect and hostility. A bunch of countries teaming up to hold China accountable, while everyone's fine with Pompeo sanctioning even the families of international court investigators who want to look into America's war crimes in Afghanistan. But are we perhaps looking, or am I looking at this the wrong way? Is America's need to stay number one the very reason that they want to treat China as this illegitimate power? And it's simply not in their own perceived best interest to respect China as China begins to outperform them in so many ways.
Well, I would say there are three structural forces that are driving US hostility towards China today, which I, of course, discuss in my book. The first, of course, is what you just mentioned, that whenever the world's #1 emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's #1 power, which today is the United States, the world's #1 power always pushes down the world's #1 emerging power. And Graham Allison has documented this quite well in his book, Destined for War. But the second structural force, which makes the US-China geopolitical contest very dangerous, is that it's driven by dark, subterranean, emotional forces. And this is what I call the fear of the yellow peril that has lain buried in the Western imagination for centuries, ever since the Mongols came close to invading Europe and taking over Europe. So this is an emotional dimension that I would like to surface, because the one lesson I learned from Freud is that the best way to get rid of subconscious impulses is to surface them into your consciousness and deal with them and then get rid of them. And that's why I bring up this yellow peril dimension. And it's real, because at the end of the 19th century, the United States Congress passed the Chinese Racial Exclusion Act, which was to keep Chinese out. And why do you keep Chinese out? Because of the fear of the yellow peril, So it's real. And the third structural dimension, which is also explains why the Democrats, as you know today, as enthusiastic as the Republicans in attacking China, right, is because there was a bipartisan expectation, a very strange expectation on the part of the United States, that as the United States progressively engaged China, as the United States opened up China's economy, by opening up China's economy, the United States would open up China's political system, and then China would become a liberal democracy, and two liberal democracies would live happily ever after. But one of the most provocative things I say in my book is to tell my American friends, be careful what you wish for, because a democratically elected leader of China will be far more nationalist than a leader of the Chinese Communist Party of China,
Right.
because the leader of the Chinese Communist Party of China can afford to take long-term rational positions towards China. But a democratically elected leader will be forced to do things that are being pressed upon him by his electorate. And there's a lot
Right.
of strong nationalist Chinese sentiment that is there, which is real. And if the Americans want to get a flavor what it is like to have a democratically elected leader in China, they should watch what Erdogan of Turkey is doing, you know. Erdogan in Turkey disappointed many people in the West, but then that's what happens when you have a democratically elected leader. He has to represent the nationalist aspirations of his people, and therefore he changes Hagia Sophia back into being a mosque. And you know that if the Chinese become nationalists and revisit the 100 years of humiliation, they may start demanding reparations from the West for
Right.
what happened for 100 years. And so it's actually very how do you say, very reasonable for the Chinese not to raise these issues. And so this is why the United States should really reconsider whether it is in the United States national interest. And I keep emphasizing this, okay? I'm not advocating an anti-American position. I'm actually telling Americans, think carefully where your real interests lie.
Right.
And your real interests should not be a result of wishful thinking, but going back to Lee Kuan Yew, a result of careful analysis of where your real geopolitical interests lie.
Right. Yeah. And I guess there's a little bit of a dilemma in that also, because, yeah, you're absolutely right. Imagining what a leader here in China who needed to basically win a popularity contest would have to do, what that would look like. But I like one of the other points you make in your book where you say that one of the national interests of America is to stay as number one. And if they really believed that pushing democracy onto China, if they really believed that China adopting democracy would make them even more powerful, would make their people even more prosperous, do you think they'd really want them to have democracy? So I guess there's two balancing things. It's like, you know, democracy would be bad for Americans. I mean, democracy in China would be bad for Americans in some ways, but perhaps some of the people who are really pushing for it are looking forward to the mess that could possibly come out from that.
Yeah. Well, that's right. And I know one of the great things that, I mean, I'm genuinely puzzled by this, and to be honest with you, because, you know, America spends more money on strategic think tanks. So America has the best strategic think tanks in the world in terms of quality of mind of people and the amount of money it spends. But America has the worst strategic thinking in the world, because the United States is often carrying out policies that are against long-term American national interests.
Right.
You know, so it's actually in America's interest, frankly, to see a very careful, very slow transition in China. And you know, the best strategic thinker the West had was Napoleon, who said, let China sleep. For when China wakes up, China will shake the world. And here is China trying to wake up slowly, gradually, adjusting to the world. And what does America do? America does the opposite of what Napoleon advised and goes and shakes up China and says, wake up, excuse me. You know, that's not in your interest, you know. So, you know, it's almost as though the ABC of strategic thinking has been missing from the American policy making. And that's why, you know, one of the points I make in the book at the very beginning is that the man who gave me the fundamental insight for my book, which is that the United States lacks a comprehensive long-term strategy to deal with China, is America's greatest living strategic thinker, Henry Kissinger. And I'm sure, I have absolutely no doubt that he's very, very troubled by how the United States has been treating China, because in his own book on China, he keeps emphasizing the Chinese are playing a long game, right? They're playing Go, not chess. And United States must play a long game. But instead, the United States is playing a very short-term game, responding to emotional impulses, as you saw in the recent speeches by Trump administration officials, rather than sitting down carefully, rationally, analytically, working out a balanced and realistic long-term policy, which is what, in that sense, I'm actually trying to be helpful to the United States by saying there is a more rational way of managing your relations with China. And think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you talk about the think tanks also and their participation in a lot of the trouble of what's going on. But I mean, you kind of touch on the problem with that also in your book. I mean, you just have to look at who some of these think tanks are funded by. You know, I get into a lot of discussions on Twitter, and it's really interesting to see a lot of these people working for these think tanks are the ones who love to call guys like me tankies. And it's interesting because they're funded by people that actually make actual tanks. And so I know you were talking in your book where, you know, some of these arms manufacturers have manufacturing facilities in key congressional areas as well in America. And it's like, how do you get around that? So, you know, I'm glad you talked about that in the book also, because that seems like that's an issue that needs to be fixed before you can actually get quality advice to the right people, isn't it?
Yeah, but you see, the curious thing here is that, you know, some of America's greatest leaders, like Eisenhower, you know, and I have a quote from him somewhere that says that every tank, every fighter jet, every aircraft carrier that you build, you're robbing the poor of America, which is true, because, you know, really, America today doesn't need 11 aircraft carriers. And of course, as you know, the other point I make in the book that a Harvard professor, Tim Colton, told me is that American aircraft carriers are yesterday's weapons. You know, they're sitting ducks in the face of hypersonic new Chinese missiles. So it doesn't make sense to invest money in aircraft carriers or spend money or burn money in aircraft carriers. And similarly, George Kennan also emphasized, you know, in all his writings, he said at the end of the day, the outcome of the contest, he was talking, of course, between the United States and Soviet Union, he says will not be determined by how many guns or how many bombs we will have. It will depend at the end of the day on which society has greater spiritual vitality. And that's dead right. And so what the United States should be doing rationally, if the Chinese challenge is real, the Chinese challenge is not military. So reduce your defense expenses. The Chinese challenge will depend on which society is more vibrant. And frankly, if you look at it objectively in terms of data, the United States is the only major developed society where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over a 30-year period, creating what the two Princeton University economists, Case and Deaton, call a sea of despair among the white working classes. So if Kennan were alive today, he says, let's fix our spiritual vitality first. And then by contrast, as you know, in China, the Chinese people, in terms of improvement of their well-being, improvement of their standard of living, have just experienced their best 40 years in 4,000 years. So there's far greater spiritual vitality in China today among its people. And just this weekend, I've begun reading a new paper by the Harvard Kennedy Ash Center, pointing out how the resilience of the Chinese Communist Party rests on the fact that the vast majority of Chinese people are very happy with the Chinese Communist Party. And I personally, as you know, came from a very poor family, and very lucky. I've done very well. When you consider I was put on a special feeding program when I was 6 years old, I had no flush toilet, 6 of us living in one bedroom and things like that. So I've experienced real poverty. And I know the greatest liberation, the first great liberation in life is to be liberated from poverty. And you know, if 800 million people get liberated from poverty by the Chinese Communist Party, why should they overthrow the Chinese Communist Party? That has liberated their lives in such a powerful way. And I wonder why. These are huge realities. This is not a little hidden stone. This is a huge boulder staring at your face, which American thinkers cannot see.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting about the spiritual vitality, but they're focusing on all these other things, because I guess the argument you could make also is one of the other things is going to be the technology sector, because it seems like wars are fought kind of online these days, and you can imagine that's why they're going around trying to undo a lot of Huawei deals. I can't imagine that TikTok is really being considered to be banned from the US because they're afraid the Chinese Communist Party is going to steal videos of people dancing to Justin Bieber. But I think it's that they potentially could lose their dominance on global social media. But so it seems like what's tying into that is the way they do that is also kind of demonizing and trying to turn everybody else against China. But to me, it seems like overall, America hasn't really been doing a good job of this in terms of, making allies. They're stealing PPE shipments from their partners, threatening them over deals with China, penalizing partners for following the JCPOA deal with Iran that they decided to violate and walk away from, and their weaponized U.S. dollar. It just seems so disorganized and undermines their efforts to team up on China. And especially when you consider, and you talk about this in your book, the vulnerability of incentivizing people to find an alternative to the US dollar, like you covered in your book. Yeah. So it seems like, what is the strategy? I mean, it's like, and it seems like none of these other countries are really paying attention to this. They're kind of they're not looking at what is America doing to us now? What kind of a partner are they with us now? Instead, they're thinking about what might China do. They're theorizing about what might China do. It just seems very disorganized, doesn't it?
Well, I think I would say the reaction of the rest of the world, if you want to understand it, I think it's still in a stage of bewilderment. Because, the United States, by and large, to be fair, since 1945, has played a very benign role on the global stage and created the 1945 rules-based order, which has benefited not just the United States, but it's benefited most of the world. And certainly Singapore's success is very much, and my success is very much a result of the 1945 rules-based order. So by and large, even though the United States has made mistakes from time to time, the rest of the world assume that the United States would always be a rational actor, and the United States would be a generous actor, taking into consideration the interests of other countries also, and not just the United States. And certainly that was true of Barack Obama, I would say. But of course, the Trump administration has come as a big shock to everyone. And they're still trying to figure out whether this is a permanent shift in the American policies or just a temporary aberration. But at the same time, the key point here is that the United States has built up reservoirs of goodwill around the world, and which is why countries are not reacting so strongly. But of course, the Trump administration, sadly, is draining away these reservoirs of goodwill, and that's very dangerous for the United States. And certainly the one key vulnerability which I highlight in the book is that the US dollar's role as a global reserve currency is a major asset for the United States, but also potentially its Achilles heel, because, as I document in the book, the United States should not be complaining about the trade deficit with China, because when the reason you get a trade deficit is that the Chinese people have to work very hard, maybe 18 hours a day, making products that they can then export to the United States, which American consumers enjoy. And how do they pay for it? The US Treasury can just print money and pay for these imports, That's a great privilege that the United States have. And as I quote several economists that say, with the US dollar serving as a global reserve currency, America can afford to live beyond its means. Therefore, it's in America's national interest to preserve the US dollar as a global reserve currency. But by weaponizing it and then now using it as a weapon against other states, the United States is sadly creating incentives for countries to walk away from the US dollar. And again, here I'm again speaking, I'm telling United States that what you're doing is not in your national interests, that you should not be weaponizing the US dollar. You should make the US dollar the best loved currency in the world, because that's how you preserve the status of the US dollar as a global reserve currency. But you're right, when the three major allies, Germany, France, and UK, set up Instex to trade with Iran and to bypass the US dollar, that's a dangerous warning sign that I would pay very close attention to. But again, because there's a lack of comprehensive long-term strategic thinking in the United States is also not paying attention to its strategic vulnerabilities. In fact, as a friend of the United States, I'm saying this is your biggest strategic vulnerability.
Right. Yeah. They seem to be overestimating how far they can kind of push this. You know, obviously the trade deals that are set up between China and Iran recently also are going to be settled in renminbi. You've got, as you mentioned a little bit, also the blockchain kind of e-renminbi also that could somehow fit into the system. But I mean, there are, and the Instex, is it called Instex or Intex? The system you're talking about.
If I'm not mistaken, it's Instex, but I may be wrong.
Yeah. So all of these kind of systems and frameworks being set up, and the groundwork is being laid for what would be the most terrible thing for the U.S., as you mentioned, and they're not looking. You know, I think one of the things too is tying back into what you were talking about, whether it's left or right, everybody kind of demonizing China. I remember seeing one of the political ads that Biden was attacking Trump, and basically it looked like this presidential race was going to be a competition between who's going to hate China more, which is it was the most awkward thing. And people are afraid to say, like, politicians aren't allowed to say positive things about China. I remember when Bernie Sanders was running, they dug up a really old video of him where he said that the Soviet Union has great social programs, and in Russia, the subways are beautiful. They have chandeliers. And they used that as a video to say, look at him saying something good about a communist country. Yeah. It was like just this, so the Red Scare, you know, back then. And I was like, what? But that's legitimately true. But it's created a situation. Oh, you go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was going to say that what you just pointed out, you're right. I mean, the next 4 months leading up to the presidential election in November will be very nasty for U.S.-China relations. And to some extent, I can understand why the Democrats have to beat up on China, because if they're seen to be soft on China, they'll be accused of course, being having sold out to China. But as you know, in 1992, Bill Clinton, when he was running against President George H.W. Bush, was also very hard on China, and he famously said, "I will not, unlike President George H.W. Bush, I will not coddle the butchers of Beijing." That's a very strong statement to make. What's interesting is that a year later, in November 1993, I was personally present at the first APEC Leaders Summit meeting in Blake Island off Seattle, and I was present on the island in a kind of a tent, so not very a big tent, but still a tent, where I was present when Bill Clinton met President Chiang Zemin of China, and President Bill Clinton coddled President Chiang Zemin of China, and I saw it in my own eyes. So I hope that after the elections there'll be some rationality, but at the same time, since America is a country that has the greatest freedom of speech, that you're not shot for going against conventional wisdom, I hope some leading voices will come out and say, come on, at the end of the day, yes, we have to try and win elections, but we also have to be responsible. And let's acknowledge that China is a reality that we have to live with. And as George Kennan always said, don't insult your adversary. You have to deal with them in due course. Right. So the instinct to impulse, the instinct to insult China, which has become deeply embedded in American body politic, that they should find ways and means of restraining it, because it's not healthy also, frankly. Even in your personal life, it's not healthy to adopt such negative attitudes towards other people.
Right, yeah. And I think it kind of ties into also what you were saying, what could happen in China with democracy. The negative things that come with democracy is exactly that. You have to just play to the masses, even if you don't really mean it. Even if, like you said, a year or 2 years later, you're going to be literally coddling them. But this kind of a negative attitude, it's like, I mean, the other thing too is like, what is the use of free speech if you have to self-censor yourself like this, which is an ironic thing too, because everybody's always accusing companies of self-censoring themselves for China, but that's literally what politicians are doing. And I feel like when they do this and they rely on this, evil, country outside of America, it's created, I think it's contributed to the situation you're talking about in your book, where China and its people are willing to learn about the positives from America, but America is not willing to learn anything from China. And it's created a situation where America's system looks stale compared to China's ironically ever-evolving political system.
Yeah.
And
see,
Go ahead.
The paradox here is one, actually, that was very well explained to me by an Indian political scientist. And when he was comparing India and China, he said the difference between India and China is that India is an open society and China is a closed society. But he said India is an open society with a closed mind and China is a closed society with an open mind. And I think the same comparison today holds true between the United States and China, because the United States is an open society and China is a closed society. But United States is an open society with a closed mind, and China is a closed society with an open mind. And I find in my discussions with Chinese intellectuals, Chinese policy makers, they are far more open and aware of what's going on in real terms in the United States of America than Americans are of what's happening in China. And I tell you, when you talk of self-censorship, when I was doing this research for my book, and I spent at least 5-6 months in the United States and Harvard, Columbia, and Georgetown University, I can tell you that several of the China scholars, when I asked them, why aren't you speaking out to try and moderate the anti-China drumbeat in the United States? And the answer they gave me was that, Kishore, I cannot speak out. I would be crucified. If anybody says anything that is even remotely positive about China, you're crucified, absolutely crucified.
It's
and
really
that's also why I decided I should be the one to come up with the book, because I'm actually expressing things which I think many Americans want to express, And I'm actually very heartened that, Farid Zakaria told me it's an excellent book, and he recommended it to his audience in the global GPS program. And Martin Wolf, who says openly that he's very pro-American, told me it's an excellent book. And he's given me a wonderful new blurb and endorsement for the book. So I think those who are more thoughtful in the United States of America really appreciate my book, because all I'm trying to do is to, in a very rational way, explain America to China and China to America. But in a rational way, without passing judgments, without insulting anybody, but just being very low-key and factual in my analysis.
Yeah, that's interesting. When you mentioned, open country with closed mind, it made me think of a quote by Eric Lee, who says, in China, you can't change the party, but you can change the policies. But in the United States, you can change the party, but you can't change the policies. So it's really a
I must
dynamic.
say, Eric, that's brilliant on the part of Eric. He's a friend of mine. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, he's great. He's got some good ideas. But what you were talking about, it's interesting. So you decided to say things that other people can't say, and you're kind of taking the heat for it, which is kind of interesting. I had a conversation with 2 nights ago. I had an 1.5-hour conversation with my Swiss-born Tibetan friend, and he's lived in China. He's come over to China, lived in China for 10 years, and he absolutely loves it. And he sent me some messages saying to keep doing what I'm doing in terms of some of my videos, but same kind of thing. He wouldn't dare do it himself. He's living back in Europe now, and he would be absolutely roasted by his other, fellow second, third generation Tibetans who have been taught to hate China. So you've got this whole kind of situation of, as I said, self-censorship. But onto the topic of, you were talking about speaking to intellectuals, and I'm really interested about this. Because, in your idea, you talk about eventually, all societies become democracies or something along the lines of that.
Yeah.
But what I've witnessed on the ground here is even the Chinese people who had great respect for Western democratic systems, and many of them studied and worked overseas, have started to reevaluate their ideas. It really started with the Hong Kong riots, particularly because of how mainlanders and Mandarin speakers were frequently attacked. Which in so many ways exemplifies to them Plato's philosophies on democracy about being mob rule. But especially after seeing America's handling of coronavirus and all this kind of stuff, and there are, of course, other democracies that handled it well, but from their point of view, they see the risks of what democracy might produce compared to what they have now and the direction they've been moving over the past few decades. So in your mind, do you think democracy really is still inevitable for China, or they might revert back to just further perfecting and developing, fine-tuning their meritocracy system more so?
Well, I mean, that's a very big question. And I think none of us can claim to know the answer. Because, we are dealing with moving targets here.
Right.
And we are dealing with two big moving targets. First of all, we're dealing with the United States, which frankly, until recently, has been the world's most successful society. And the world's most successful society by far. As you know, I begin the book with a fictional memo to President Xi Jinping saying, when China takes on the United States, whatever we do, we must never underestimate the United States. And it will be fatal for China to underestimate the United States. And one of the key points I make is that in China, chaos is regarded as something terrible that should be suppressed. And Americans love chaos and the dynamism of free speech and so on and so forth. But at the same time, the United States, because it has been so successful for so long, cannot conceive of the possibility that the United States may have peaked and may be going down in a structural fashion.
Right.
Structural fashion. Because, and this is a key thing that I wanted to warn my American friends, I said, if it's a contest within a dynamic democracy and a communist party system, then the dynamic democracy will win. But if you dig deep down into American society, it is frankly no longer a democracy. It is no longer a government of the people, by the people, for the people. It's become a plutocracy. Right. And a plutocracy, you have government of the people, by the rich, for the rich. And there's data. I give so much data in the book that documents it. And so that's also where Martin Wolf agrees with me, that United States has become a plutocracy. Now, reversing plutocracy, by the way, is very difficult. And it's a bit like the struggle against feudalism, because once the lords and the feudal class become entrenched, the whole power structure reinforces their power. And the Americans haven't understood this, And I'm surprised that, like someone like Francis Fukuyama has, as far as I know, not warned about the dangers of plutocracy affecting the United States of America. And I think, by contrast, I believe China has become a meritocracy, where they're finding the best people to run the country. And that's why China has done so well in many areas. That's why China has recovered so well, fastest from global crisis. That's why China has responded so well to COVID-19. So these are the new realities. And so the moving target here is that America may have peaked and may be going down, and China is now just in the very beginning of a major renaissance of the oldest and most successful civilization in the world. And so if the Chinese can keep up this meritocracy, and if they can keep up a tradition of having a government that, again, going back to the opposite of plutocracy, a government that actually serves the people, and improves their well-being, then the Chinese political system, as suggested by this Harvard Kennedy School paper, can actually be very resilient and can last as long as it continues to serve the people. So that's why it's a big mistake on the part of the United States, especially if you look at the speeches of American leaders saying, in a choice between democracy and communism, of course you choose democracy. But hang on a second, if it's a choice which is a realistic one, and this is the one I describe in great detail in my book, is between plutocracy and meritocracy. It's actually rational to choose a meritocracy over a plutocracy, because if I'm at the bottom 10% of a society, as John Rawls says, that's what matters, I'm more likely to be rescued from the bottom 10% in a meritocracy than I am to be rescued from the bottom 10% in a plutocracy. But no one says that in the United States.
Yeah, I think, so I mean, I grew up in Canada, and, we grow up with these ideas of, these words like, freedom and democracy, and we don't actually think about it any deeper than that. Democracy is the be all and end all word. It doesn't matter that, for example, Freedom House shows that 70% of democracies lack some of the most basic freedoms. But I think that's part of the problem is, as soon as you, especially the name of the Chinese Communist Party, that's the worst possible name for a foreigner to hear. It's got the word communist in it. Democracy is what we, people really need to be thinking about this a little bit deeper. And I think you do that in your in your book. But
that's why in the Harvard lecture I gave, the Harvard Kennedy School, I said that the Chinese CCP should stand not for the Chinese Communist Party, but for the Chinese Civilization Party. And once you realize it's the Chinese Civilization Party, you realize you're not taking on a communist party, you're taking on Chinese civilization. And by the way, it's only been around 4,000 years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think when people really understand how China works, I think if somebody read your book, they with a really open mind, they'd understand why China wouldn't want to rush in to something like a democracy. At the end of the day, I almost feel like, though, even if it was, it might kind of end up like Singapore, because I learned something from your book where, it's the same party that's elected over and over again, especially when you consider those reports and everything that we saw in terms of the trust barometers that Chinese people have in their system. But I guess the other risk too, though, is like you don't know if China will eventually move to a democracy. But one of the things that probably needs to be carefully looked at, unfortunately, is how hard and often how violent sometimes the U.S. tries to export their ideologies onto others, and how much more vulnerable open political systems become. But on that topic, I like the point that you made in your book about how every major imperial power throughout history felt they were superior than everyone else, and spreading their kingdom and ideologies was a gift to the world. And today you have people, as you pointed out also in your book, literally saying word for word that America is the greatest gift to the world in centuries, or possibly ever. It's like, how responsible do you feel this level of kind of arrogance is for continually underestimating China's rise, where people have and also have a tendency to just get outright annoyed at some of the points you make on China's rise.
Well, I'm glad you raised that, because fortunately on that sphere there are some American voices, the realist voices that whom as you know, I quote in the book, and two of them are Steve Walt of Harvard and John Mearsheimer of Chicago. I actually add as an appendix in my book an essay by Steve Walt where he tells American, and I wanted him to say this because it's a bit awkward for a non-American to say this. Steve Walt says, "We Americans believe we are being very virtuous. Excuse me, do you know how many people we have killed overseas, fighting wars every year?" And many Americans, if you did a poll, they would always believe that China today is much more aggressive in the military front than the United States is. But the one fact that virtually no American knows is that China has not fought a major war in 40 years since its war against Vietnam in 1979, and has not had a naval fired a bullet, literally, for 30 years. And of course, it's unfortunate what happened at the India-China border, but as you know, no guns were fired there. It showed a certain degree of strategic discipline on the part of India and China. Whereas by contrast, the United States, even under President Obama, in 1 year, in the last year of his presidency, President Obama dropped 26,000 bombs on 7 countries, That's shocking. That's really shocking.
It's really remarkable, and I think the ironies go further when I'm not going to get into too much because there's so much propaganda, and this is something I tear apart sometimes on my own Twitter about the propaganda against Xinjiang and what's going on in Xinjiang. But I want to get because that's a big topic, but I want to get specifically onto something related to what you're saying. Is literally 2 years ago, the U.S. was bombing and targeting Uyghur groups just across the border from China. Uyghur militant groups, literally 2 years ago. In 2002, the East Turkestan group was listed as a terrorist group by the U.S. And yeah, literally, you've got these countries in the West going around killing Muslims all over the world, and then as soon as they think something's happening in China, they just blow up. And of course, it's not really about a genuine care for anybody here, but there's just so much hypocrisy, isn't there?
Yeah, well, I always say when it comes to human rights issues, ask yourself a very simple question. Do you want to do good or do you want to feel good? If you want to feel good, just condemn, issue statements, attack China. And will it improve anybody's situation? No way. But if you want to do good, then you should talk privately to China, quietly to China, and say, okay, can we discuss how we can make things better? And frankly, that it would be good for the US and China to have a private, intense dialogue about what to do about all these radical groups, because there are in this world radical groups. Right. And frankly, they pose a common threat to the United States, as we saw in 9/11, and as we saw in China. China had its 9/11 moment also when the Uyghurs did kill some innocent Chinese too. So, and I actually believe that we can create a world of tomorrow in which the Islamic world, which has got 1.4 billion people, can be modernized and can be brought into the modern world. And that way there'll be no more Osama bin Ladens, no more Al-Qaedas, no more Abu Sayyaf groups. We can kill all of them by promoting economic development in all these Islamic states and all these Islamic societies. But that should be a common objective of the United States and China. And that's actually where they have a common interest. But of course, from the point of view of the United States, the short-term gains of using the Uyghur issue as a propaganda weapon against China overrides their longer-term interests, which are being pushed aside in dealing with a common problem together.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you've got that's always been the case, though, isn't it? I mean, you have Hillary Clinton, who openly admitted that, the U.S. funded groups like the Mujahideen and all of this stuff. They're regularly funding these kinds of groups. And, one of the most awkward ones is there's a Uyghur activist from the U.S. called Rushan Abbas. And she is very vocal about these supposed kind of re-education camps or whatever you want to call it. And she literally celebrates the time that she spent working in Guantanamo Bay with the CIA overseeing Uyghur prisoners. And she admits it. She says, this isn't like a theory. So she says, yes, I did this and I'm very proud of my time. And now I'm going to fight for Uyghurs that are locked up in in China. So it's not really, it was really, it's really quite awkward and surprising. Well, I shouldn't say surprising, really. But it doesn't seem like we're going to get anywhere close. And maybe I'm just a little bit more pessimistic to the idea of America and China or any other country really, truly trying to stop terrorism, because it's always the geopolitical interest that outweighs actual progress. Again, I hope I'm just being more pessimistic, but based on what we've seen over the years.
I would say don't give up hope, because I hope at the end of the day, and that's why I keep on writing. This is my 8th book, but I've been issuing, and frankly, in my first book that I wrote called Beyond the Age of Innocence on U.S. relations with the rest of the world in 2005, and I say this with a lot of sadness. I gave a lot of advice to the United States on how we should manage the challenge from the Islamic world, how we should manage the obvious challenge coming from China. This is 15 years ago. And if the United States had heeded my advice in my book 15 years ago, it wouldn't be having both the problems it is having now.
Right. Yeah. It's well, hopefully we can see a change eventually in regards to that. But tying our conversation a little bit, moving into some current events in terms of the discussion about the American political system and structure, which looks like it's been in trouble for quite a while here. And you do a pretty good job of pointing out how corporations write legislation and how lobby groups work and how military equipment manufacturers strategically place their facilities, as we mentioned earlier, to maximize their influence in Washington, D.C. So my question is, considering this and the increasing wealth gap and lack of upward kind of opportunities for poor people to enter the middle class, and as you mentioned, the bottom 50% becoming poorer, do you feel this plays a role in the current protests and riots that are going on, kind of underneath it all? And how hopeful are you that these protests can actually affect positive change? Or if you feel that potentially this just accelerated the decline of the West that's been illustrated in your book in some parts?
Well, I think, protests are, of course, very useful in terms of expressing sentiments and getting rid of anger that's in the society. But protests themselves will not result in the changes. Basically, you require the establishment and the elite to come together and acknowledge that you got to change literally. And so, for example, to put it very simply, there are very simple solutions to America's problems. The wealthy in America have engineered the tax system in such a way that their taxes are being reduced all the time. And it's actually in their interest to pay more taxes that could then go to helping the bottom 10%. And, this is not rocket science,
Right, yeah.
At the end of the day, it's a question about how you distribute the wealth and income of a society. And in fact, if you go by what American philosophers like, and I quote John Rawls a lot, and if Americans just went back to read a theory of justice and say, how do we implement a theory of justice today? Yes, that would solve America's problems. These are not ideas from outside. These are American ideas that can be used to retrieve the problems inside the United States of America. But there is, but see that requires also a certain degree of brutal honesty in the analysis, and that's what's missing at this stage. So my fear is that America will have to undergo a bigger crisis than what it has today before it wakes up to realize the problem.
Well, especially, I guess, because you said it requires certain people giving up power also. So now, in terms of, I know you've got to go soon, so I'll just get through a couple last few questions. I know I listened to your debate on COVID-19 and accelerating the shift in order, and I wonder if you're of the opinion that if America is no longer led by Donald Trump, that some of the damage that he's done, isolating the U.S. and breaking ties, do you think it can be undone with a administration change, or some of the stuff he's done has kind of really made some permanent damage to U.S. relations?
Well, I hope that, let's see whether Biden wins. I hope that a Biden administration, especially if he relies on the advice of Barack Obama, will help to repair some of the damage that has been done by the Trump administration. But nonetheless, it's a mistake to think that just because you change your president, you can change all the structural vested interests. Like, for example, the logical thing for the United States to do would be to cut its defense budget and spend more money. And for example, as I say, I have a chapter called America, Can America Make U-Turns? And America should just stop fighting wars in the Middle East. Just stop, because if it had, it spent $5 trillion on post 9/11 wars. If it had spent that $5 trillion on the bottom 50% in America, each citizen of the bottom 50% would have received a check for $30,000. Right? But all you have to do is stop fighting wars. And I don't understand why America cannot stop fighting wars. So this is why. So this requires deeper structural changes than just a change in personality.
Yeah, it probably goes back to those strategically located weapons manufacturers around the U.S. also, doesn't it? But in that regard, speaking of war, and this kind of escalating situation that we have. I know that you've repeatedly said a few times you don't ever see really a hot war between the U.S. and China, and I hope you're right on that. But with what's been happening recently, especially with how awkward and forced some of these escalations are you, as your opinion, even if only slightly, changing a little bit in terms of the chances of a war? Or are you still as sure as ever? I'm just wondering if the situation has changed your ideas a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I remain reasonably confident that there will not be a nuclear war between the United States and China, because in a nuclear war, you don't have a winner and a loser. You have a loser and a loser. And frankly, even with 300 nuclear weapons, China can destroy the United States several times over. So it doesn't need 6,000 nuclear weapons, which is what the U.S. has, you know.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I will confess to you that one thing I'm very worried about in the next 4 months, going up to November, somebody in the Trump administration, not necessarily President Trump, might think that it is in their interest to start a small skirmish in the South China Sea and have U.S. and Chinese naval vessels firing shots at each other. And that will immediately create a rally around the flag and help Trump get reelected. That's the sort of thing that worries me now, happening in the next 4 months.
That's exactly the thing I've been writing about too, and having kind of a sinking feeling about. And I even put a thing out on my, because there was a story recently of these melon seeds that were sent to different people across the U.S. and they were saying, oh, they came from China, be careful, don't open them. And it almost felt like it was some sort of a weird kind of like a false flag of some sorts that was trying to be developed. So I posted a Twitter the thread where I said, make your predictions about what's going to happen before November if there is going to be a false flag or a provocation. And there was somebody who mentioned the South China Sea. They said there are some articles they're already putting out saying that China has these killer submarines underneath the ocean and all this kind of stuff. It's really quite worrying. But I hope that doesn't actually happen. So what I'll do though, as I said, I know you got to go soon. I just want to finish talking about the rest of the world's relationship with America versus China, because it's been remarkable to see how a lot of these countries have been bullied or taken advantage of by America, remaining loyal to them. And so instead of paying attention to what is happening to them with America, they're theorizing about what might happen when dealing with China. And Australia is a major example that comes to mind, and you mentioned also in your book, particularly considering their location. They're Asia's neighbor, and their trade with China is far more important than their trade with America. Yet they still act as China's little sheriff, or deputy sheriff, as Bush once put it. So how do you feel about this? How important do you think it is that other countries really start rethinking their relationships here? And do you see any sign or hope of that happening?
Well, I think it's very clear that one thing I emphasize in the chapter, How Will Other Countries Choose, is that most countries in the world don't want to see this US-China geopolitical contest get out of hand. And most countries would prefer the United States and China to work together to focus on the common global challenges. In my book, I talk about global warming, and I say that future historians will see US and China as two tribes of apes fighting each other while the forest around them is burning, if they continue fighting while global warming is happening. So let's focus on the common challenges. That's what the majority of the world's population wants to see. And I think especially after COVID-19, the view of most countries in the world is, please stop, press the pause button on the US-China geopolitical contest. Let's get together and fight COVID-19, kill COVID-19, and then maybe we can get together and resume the contest. I think that's a sort of almost unanimous message from the rest of the world coming towards the United States and China.
Yeah, that would be something great. And I think for anybody who's in any position of power, I really hope they read your book, because you give a lot of perspective on that. You talk about, I know you've mentioned in our interview here, you've given a lot of advice to the US in that book, but you also give a lot of good advice to China as well. So it's really a balanced perspective. I really enjoyed the book, and I hope that more people do read it. But I know you've got to head off for another interview. But once international travel resumes properly, if you're ever passing through the Shenzhen area, you have to make sure and stop by. I will come. Yeah. Sounds good. Anyways, it was really nice talking to you, and we'll nice talking to you too. Yeah. Take care.